Hi everyone, I'm Carly Luker and I'm going to be presenting for you this week. The chapter that I am focusing on is chapter 5, and it's all about understanding learners with special needs, but more specifically the high incidence disabilities that some students may present in our future classrooms as educators. So there are some different categories for the students with these disabilities. The first category, and the one I'm going to be focusing on the most, is high incidence disabilities. And that's a learning disability, a speech or learning impairment, a mild to moderate intellectual disability, or an emotional/behavioral disorder. And I'm going to be going into more detail about all of those as my slides go on. About 3 out of 4 students, ranging in ages from 6 to 21, are served under the IDEA Act, Part B, and they all have high incidence disabilities. The other category for disabilities is called a low incidence disabilities, and that's orthopedic or other health impairments, low vision or blindness, hard of hearing/deafness, a traumatic brain injury or TBI, deaf blindness, autism spectrum disorder, and multiple severe disabilities. These are referred to as low incidence because they actually affect a very low population of students compared to the high incidence ones that I listed above. So there's different ways that these disabilities are organized, and the book talks about all of them and agrees and disagrees with certain ones. There's 3 schemes or groups that are used. There's special education categories. So the IDEA Act and other organizations encourage using disability labels, which then translate into specific SPED categories. Our book said, when it comes to school children, the government has decided to define disabilities using a categorical approach. And states are required each year to use these federal categories to report the numbers of students with disabilities being served. So with that, it just says we're going to put students into different categories depending on what disability level they are at and what disabilities they have. And then each year the school in the states report back and say, this is how many students we have with this and X, Y, and Z. So, for example, ADHD, sickle cell anemia, and others are in the other health impairments category. We're going to talk a little bit more about ADHD, though, as we go on. So here's some more information about how the disabilities are organized. So there's 3 different ways that they look at them, and I mentioned the 3 schemes earlier in the last slide. So the first one is this perspective on the disability. So unfortunately, laws are difficult to change, as we all know that. So some of the government agencies' names that they use may not be what our parents think are current, and that can cause some problems, and yeah, it's a whole thing. So these categories were developed because they related directly to how and where students were educated and what they were taught. So for example, these government agencies call it autism, but we now call it autism spectrum disorder. And when we know a student has autism spectrum disorder, we then know where to place them in what specific classroom and how they can be educated and exactly what they're being taught and how they're being taught it. And another thing is that we call it specific learning disabilities while government agencies still refer to them as learning disabilities, because learning disabilities is a pretty broad term. And when you say specific learning disabilities, you're then able to narrow it down to a smaller percentage of disabilities. The second category is the severity of the disability. So a lot of the professionals believe that using a non-categorical approach to group students is a more educational way of doing it. And when we do it that way, we're actually able to learn more about these students compared to just the perspective on the disability that we have. So they propose that they get grouped off by the severity of their problems instead of the types of disability they have. And there's 4 groups when it comes to the severity. It's mild, moderate, severe, and profound. Mild obviously being a pretty low case of it, they're pretty independent, and then profound being more independent and more reliant on other people to be successful. So the prevalence of the disability. Chapter 5 is outlined by the prevalence of the disability. So they focus mainly on high incidence disabilities, and then in the next chapter they go on to low incidence disabilities. But the way that our book has labeled it, they go from the most common disability in high incidence to the least common, or like the least recorded, I'd say. So that's how our book decided to organize the disabilities for us to learn. So there's some attributes when it comes to the learning disabilities, or the specific learning disabilities, as I referenced earlier. So the IDEA Act, along with response to intervention, help prevent students from struggling for a long period of time before they're able to seek help. So old definitions of a learning disability would require a student to be 2 grade levels behind before being allowed special education help, which meant that they had to struggle for 2 whole years before receiving any help at all. And we learned about that in one of our IRIS modules. So with this, we're now able to not have these students struggle for 2 whole years before they seek help. So there's different types of learning disabilities. There's overall of achievement, reading, mathematics, and written expression disabilities. And all 4 of these learning disabilities could need a more intense and individualized intervention for the student to be successful when comparing them to other students in their grade. And like I said, we learned about this in our IRIS module a few weeks ago. So some characteristics of learning disabilities. There's something called unexpected underachievement. And it's the defining characteristic of if a child has a learning disability. And this occurs when a student is performing significantly lower than their peers, and they're performing at a level that surprises their teachers and parents, because their teachers and parents are expecting them to give a certain amount of achievement and hitting that achievement depending on what grade they're in, but they're having an underachievement, and it's actually very unexpected from their teachers and also their parents. So there's the academic characteristics of a learning disability, and that means they're difficult to teach, weak in basic language skills, and have some memory deficits. The social characteristics in these students is they can be immature, shy, and they can often misinterpret social and nonverbal cues. And then the behavioral characteristics, they are inattentive, impulsive, and disorganized. And I got the last 3, academic, social, and behavioral, from our book. I can't remember exactly what page, though. So this whole chapter kind of talks about the relevance and why we need to be learning about these things and talking about these things. So the learning disabilities is the largest high incidence disability in our school. And it's the biggest SPED category. So about 38% of the students have identified having a learning disability. And this is actually male dominated, which 2/3 of their students having learning disabilities are actually male. It costs more to educate than a general education student. When we have special education students and people with these disabilities, it costs the district and the state and etc. more to actually educate than a normal general education student, because we have to have all these accommodations and we have the support staff and all the things that encompass our awesome SPED programs in our schools. Often this is misidentified because it is thought of a way to label students who are not being successful in general education classes. So oftentimes people don't take learning disabilities seriously because sometimes general education teachers will just be like, oh, well, they're not succeeding, so clearly they have a learning disability, which may or may not be the case. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the second highest, and this is speech and language impairments. So there are 3 parts of the speech and language impairments. The first one is communication, and that's exchanging knowledge and ideas through verbal and nonverbal cues. Their language, it's a rule-based system of communication where comprehension and the use of signs or symbols where ideas are being represented. And speech is the production of language using one's voice. So those are like the basic parts that go into speech and language, and then we're going to talk more about how the impairments come into play. So there's actually a difference between speech and language impairments. They're 2 different disabilities, but they're closely related, and that's why they are lumped into one SPED category. The speech impairment, there's a production of speech is lacking intelligence, is unpleasant, or interferes with communication. And then there's the language impairment, which disrupts communication while interfering with the understanding of the messages, communication intentions, and the actual interactions between the people. So both of these actually interfere and disrupt communication, but their other side parts are slightly different, but they're closely related enough that we put them into one SPED category. So there's 3 types of speech and language impairments. The first one is with articulation, and that's the production of speech sounds are flawed, which leads to incorrect sounds being produced. This is pretty common, I think, in young children until they learn how to actually articulate their words, but some students never actually learn how to, which causes them to have these impairments. There's fluency, and that's interruptions of the flow of speech, such as hesitations or repetitions. So that's more commonly referred to as stuttering. And I have a brother that stutters, and so I feel closely related to that one. And I can stutter sometimes when I start talking too quick. So if I do that, I'm really sorry. And then voice problems. There's an unusual pitch or noise level for the age or gender of an individual. I understood the first 2, but the last one was kind of interesting, and I didn't actually realize that that was a type of impairment, mainly because I have never interacted with anyone who's had that kind of impairment, and so that one was really interesting to learn about. So the characteristics of these, with language impairment, they compare a child's language development in comparison to those of their peers to see how they differ. So they compare 2 children by saying, okay, Jimmy is at this spot, and that's grade level, and Bob is considerably lower or doesn't quite hit where his other peers do. There's language delays, which is a slow acquisition of language with a never complete acquisition of complex language structures. So they never really learn how to become fluent in these languages, and then they never fully understand the different structures that go into language, which we all know can be very complicated and complex. The language differences was interesting. So English language learners seem fluent when they're speaking with their peers. However, they struggle academically. So just because our students seem to be well socializing, it doesn't mean that they're thriving academically. And I think that's really, really important to remember. The relevance of this is that about 20% of the students have one of these. And technically, this is the second largest SPED category, but in all reality, it should be the first when thinking of these conditions because it's 2 different conditions put into one category. So our book argues that it should actually be the first. All right, now we're going to talk about ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So not all ADHD students are eligible for SPED services. A student with ADHD doesn't have a disability identified because of the ADHD. The symptoms of ADHD overlap with other disabilities. 40% of students with ADHD are not diagnosed but could be, do not get the treatment they need. And this falls under the other health impairments category. So there's different types of ADHD. So there's 3 main groups of students that have ADHD. The first is that they don't qualify for SPED. The second is they do qualify for SPED. And the third is that they have coexisting disabilities along with ADHD. So the best way to help students with ADHD is to provide structure. So like a classroom routine. Every day you come in, you do a bell ringer, we lecture, we do an activity, etc. We need to teach content directly, and we also need to hold high expectations for them and encourage social and academic performance with these students. And it's super crucial. So students whose ADHD affects their ability to function academically are the ones who qualify for SPED. So those students who have ADHD but it doesn't interfere with their academic performance do not qualify for SPED services. And the students who are already in the disability, like who have a disability and also have ADHD, are already in SPED, but it is not because of their ADHD. So here are some characteristics of ADHD. The first is probably the most common to everyone, most well known, is hyperactivity. And that's excessive talking, squirming, and they're always on the move. Our book warned against thinking that a disruptive child is ADHD. Like you need to look for more signs than just that, because then they could get like not correctly diagnosed, and that's not good. The second one is impulsivity, and this could explain their inability to focus on class, which then leads to them distracting and disrupting the class. And then inattention, and that's when they can't focus on the task, or they're focusing on the wrong part of the task, which then becomes disruptive because they're hindering their learning and others around them. So the relevance of ADHD, this whole section on ADHD was actually really interesting to me. So an exact number does actually not exist, because we do not have to report students with ADHD because they don't fall under their own category in SPED. Like I said, they are considered other conditions, like other health impairments category instead of their own. However, our book still grouped it with high-incidence disabilities, so I think it's really important to talk about. About 45% of our students with other disabilities also have ADHD. And then 25% of our students with conduct disorder have ADHD as well. So like I said, there's that third category of students who already have disabilities, but then they have ADHD on top of those disabilities. All right, intellectual and developmental disabilities. These are often considered a low incidence disability, but in fact, it is a high incidence disability. So like the other disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities can range from mild to severe. The old term used was mental retardation, but now our textbook refers to them as intellectual and developmental disabilities, which I think is much better. The AAIDD defines these as characterized by significant limitations both in intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical skills. So like I said, that they range from mild all the way to profound. So the mild is that the learning disabilities are present, but they can work and maintain social relationships, and they can also be a contributing member to society. The moderate is that there's marked developmental delays from their childhood and some independence, but not a lot. There's adequate communication and academic skills, but they do need some support to live and work in the community. However, the degrees of support varies on the student with a disability. Severe is when a continuous need of support is needed. So they don't have any independence. They need someone else there to help them. And then profound is a severe limitation when it comes to self-care and basic life functions, continuous needs of support. So severe and profound are somewhat similar, but profound is the next step. Like they can't perform basic life functions without the help of someone. So the characteristics of these disabilities is that there's problem in the cognition, which is our mental processes. There's problems with adapting, which that actually manifests behaviorally, and there needs support to be able to sustain independence. Like I said, with the severe and the profound. Pretty much the moderate to profound has that. Need a little help for their independence. So the relevance of this is that 6.9% of students have been identified as having either an intellectual or a developmental disability. Most of them are high functioning and need little support. 16.5% are in our gen ed classes for 80% of their school day, and an additional 26.3% are in the general education classes for 40 to 79% of their school day, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so this is our last category, and this is all about emotional and behavioral disorders. So these disorders are problematic because of the justice system, the violence that occurs, and the unhappiness associated with them. Early intervention with emotional and behavioral disorders has made a world of difference. Our book defines it as characterized by behavioral or emotional responses in school so different from appropriate age, cultural, or ethnic norms that they have adversely affect educational performance. So there's 3 types of emotional or behavioral disorders. There's the externalizing type, which is tantrums, they violate basic rights of others, and they're physically aggressive, which is actually most common in males with these disorders. There's internalizing, which is over-controlled style that leads to behaviors that have them withdrawn, lonely, anxious, and these are most common in females, and they can lead to diseases like anorexia. And then there's low-incidence emotional and behavioral disorders, and while they are rare, they are very serious when a student presents with the symptoms, and the example the book gave was schizophrenia. So the characteristics of these disorders, so the students with the external disorders have the tantrums, they're non-compliant, they're aggressive, their academic performance is poor, and they coerce others around them. And then students with the internalizing patterns are more common to have depression, anxiety, and withdrawal. So the prevalence of this, I really enjoyed this section too. So gender and race are super important factors when we need to think about this type of learner. Like I said earlier, in external behaviors, it is a male-dominated area where female tend to internalize. And I thought this was super interesting that African Americans are overrepresented in this category, while Hispanic and Asian American students are underrepresented. So while you don't think race plays a card into it, like right off the top of your head, it clearly does. And this is like the lowest high incident disabilities, and the book said that was because of the stigma around mental and emotional health, which I feel is really unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. Okay, so I did some further research, and according to Stellitano, the extent to which students with high incidence disabilities are afforded effective and specialized instruction depends in large part upon the support their teachers receive. And many of the schools and teachers have a shared responsibility of supporting these kids with disabilities. However, they feel like they have little to no access to these important resources and trainings that they need to help these children. The recommendation this website gave was looking at specific teachers, general education, SPED, support staff, etc., and what they need and how we can access the relevant materials and trainings. And they said this was especially important in high school. And then, according to a high-incidence disabilities inclusion resource, there are 5 accommodations that we as gen ed teachers can implement with our high-incidence disabilities students. We need to foster their listening skills and also praise them when they have good listening skills, because when we praise them, then they're going to better understand the concept of listening. Making changes to our classroom environment. Every student is different and they learn in different kinds of environments. So moving desks around more often and making resources more available can help our high incidence disability students. Engaging our students in meaningful tasks. When a student is more engaged, they are clearly likely to learn better, no matter if they have a disability or not. Creating opportunities for communication. This helps students to get to know one another and can also help those specific students who struggle with their language productions or have a language impairment. I'm kind of iffy on that one because I feel like that would, in a way, single out our students who have a language impairment. And then the last one is creating a behavioral management system. So that's like creating our basic classroom rules. And it's very, very important that you follow through with these, especially with our high incidence disability students, because when you follow through, then they know what isn't tolerated. So, yeah, and it's really important. All right, so here's my questions for you. True or false? Students with ADHD have their own SPED category. The answer is false. So how do high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities differ? And which one is more common? High incidence, obviously, they occur more common and they occur over like a majority of students. Low incidence are not a huge demographic of students have them. So that's how they differ, and that's high incidence is clearly more common. And then true or false, emotional and behavioral disorders are not common but are quite serious. And that's true. And then I have some links here. This Sarah's Assistive Technology, it was a really cool website. I didn't mention assistive technology, but it was in the chapter, so I clicked on that, and it has a lot of great resources. And then there's a opportunity for professional development when working with high incidence disability students. And I think that it could come in handy when we are teachers ourselves and when we need to do some professional development hours. And then there's a short YouTube clip that I'll put on our forum that gives like a general overview of what a high incidence disability is. And then here is my resources. So I will get out of this. Thanks.